Can you hear the sound of an empty stomach growling in the darkness? Can you feel the weight of a mother's hands trembling as she stirs a pot that holds barely enough to feed her children? This isn't fiction. This is America in the 1940s, when every meal was a small miracle, every bite a victory against hunger and despair. Close your eyes and travel back to a time when sugar was more precious than silver, when meat required government permission, and when creativity wasn't a luxury, but the only thing standing between your family and starvation. This is the story of ordinary people who did extraordinary things with nothing but determination, ingenuity, and love. The kitchen became a battlefield. When America entered World War II, something profound happened in kitchens across the nation. Mothers became warriors. Pantries became strategic command centers. Every ingredient was a soldier in the fight to keep families alive and spirits unbroken. Picture a cold Appalachian evening in 1943. The factory whistle has blown, signaling the end of another grueling shift. Workers trudge home through streets dimmed by rationing regulations. Inside one modest kitchen, a mother stands over a pot of what would change her family's life that night. Buckwheat batter dumpling stew. She has almost nothing. Water, a handful of onions, 2 carrots, 3 small potatoes, and buckwheat flour that cost less than wheat, but tasted like sawdust if you didn't know the secret. But she does know the secret. She's been fighting this battle for 2 years now, and she's learned how to turn poverty into poetry. The broth simmers for hours, coaxing every molecule of flavor from those humble vegetables. Then comes the magic moment. She mixes buckwheat flour with water, a pinch of hoarded salt, and just enough baking powder to give it life. With a spoon, she drops dollops of this batter into the bubbling liquid. Her children press their faces against the frosted window, watching those dumplings perform their daily miracle. They sink first, disappearing into the depths. Then slowly, impossibly, they rise to the surface, puffing up like tiny balloons of hope. The children squeal with delight. It's the same reaction every time, and it never gets old. When dinner is served, nobody complains about the lack of meat. Nobody mentions that last year they had roast chicken on Thursdays. They eat slowly, savoring each bite, because this meal represents something more than food. It represents survival. It represents a mother's love that refuses to be defeated by war or rationing or empty shelves. When color became rebellion, in the gray landscape of wartime America, where dinner plates showed only shades of brown and beige, one dish dared to explode with color. The cranberry bean bake wasn't just food. It was an act of defiance, a middle finger to the depression that threatened to swallow every household whole. New England families had access to something precious, cranberry bogs that stretched like ruby carpets across the landscape. These tart berries grew without needing expensive fertilizers or imported seeds. They were nature's gift, in a time when nature seemed to have abandoned humanity. Some clever cook looked at a pot of plain white beans and asked a revolutionary question: what if I could bring beauty back to my table? The recipe was simple, but the result was magic. White beans soaked overnight until swollen with promise, layered in a baking dish with handfuls of fresh cranberries, a precious drizzle of blackstrap molasses for sweetness that made your soul sing. Then into the oven, where time and heat performed alchemy. Hours later, the beans were tender, and the cranberries had burst into a glaze that looked like liquid rubies. Children would sneak into the kitchen, drawn by the aroma of sweet and savory dancing together. They'd dip their fingers into the sauce, staining them red like war paint, grinning with the joy that only food made with love can create. This wasn't just dinner. This was proof that even in the darkest times beauty could exist. That color could return to gray lives. That hope could be served on a plate. Some families added nutmeg, hoarded like treasure in the back of cupboards. Others used cider vinegar to sharpen the edges. These small variations became family signatures, ways to claim ownership over something when the government controlled everything else. When you couldn't control the war or the rationing or the constant fear, you could at least control whether your cranberry bean bake had cinnamon or clove. The day breakfast became dinner. Imagine trying to convince hungry children that oatmeal isn't just for breakfast anymore. that the same grain that filled their morning bowls could become a savory dinner pie that would satisfy them more than any meat ever could. This was the genius of the savory oatmeal pie, a dish that represented everything beautiful about American ingenuity during wartime. Steel-cut oats, that humble breakfast staple, cooked until creamy and then transformed with sautéed onions, chopped celery, garden herbs, and the secret weapon, a splash of vinegar that tricked your taste buds into thinking they were eating meat. The mixture was poured into a simple crust made from rationed flour and lard, then baked until golden and firm. When sliced, each wedge revealed flecks of vegetables and herbs that looked almost festive, almost like the meals they remembered from before the war. Housewives valued this recipe not just because oats were cheap and available, but because it represented a psychological victory. In a world where meat pies symbolized prosperity and normalcy, being able to serve something that looked like a pie, cut like a pie, and satisfied like a pie meant you weren't defeated. You were still capable of providing comfort, of maintaining dignity, of keeping your family's hope alive. Served with a thin gravy made from pan drippings saved for weeks, or a spoonful of sharp mustard, this pie became proof that creativity could triumph over scarcity. That resourcefulness was more powerful than any ration book. Carrots became candy. When government propaganda told Americans to eat more carrots because they helped pilots see in the dark, families embraced the orange vegetable with religious fervor. But it wasn't just patriotism. It was survival dressed as duty. Victory gardens across the nation produced carrots in abundance. They were easy to grow, stored well, and provided vital vitamins that kept children healthy when illness could mean death in a time of medical shortages. But how do you make children excited about eating vegetables? You turn them into ginger-spiced carrot fritters, that's how. Picture a mother at her kitchen counter, knuckles raw from grating every last carrot from her garden. Each orange shred represents nutrition her children desperately need. She mixes the grated carrot with flour stretched thin, a little powdered milk, and the secret ingredient, chopped preserved ginger, that adds warmth and the illusion of indulgence. When those fritters hit the hot skillet, with just a whisper of reused bacon drippings, transformation happens. The edges crisp, the inside stays moist and tender. The sweet spice of ginger cuts through the earthy carrot flavor, and suddenly vegetables become thrilling. Children who normally push greens around their plates reach for seconds, then thirds. Some mothers sprinkle hoarded sugar on top, creating a faint candy-like crust that makes the fritters feel like treats rather than vegetables. Others serve them beside simple cabbage salad, balancing sweetness with crunch. In many communities, these fritters became Sunday specials, small celebrations that reminded families that even in the midst of rationing, there was still room for joy, for playfulness, for moments when food tasted like happiness instead of just fuel. The South's secret weapon, Southern families had a secret that kept them strong when the rest of the nation struggled. They knew how to use every single part of every single plant. Nothing was wasted, nothing was overlooked, nothing was thrown away. Turnip greens, those leafy tops that many people simply discarded, became the foundation of a dish that defined Southern resilience during the war years. Farmers gathered those leaves carefully, washing away every speck of precious soil before sautéing them with onions and a small cube of bacon fat, saved from previous meals like a family heirloom. The greens wilted into a deep, savory tangle that tasted far richer than its humble ingredients suggested. Spooned generously over steaming stone-ground grits, that plentiful southern grain that wasn't heavily rationed, the combination delivered vitamins, minerals, and enough hearty texture to satisfy families after long days in fields or factories. Neighbors traded turnip tops for cornmeal, ensuring nothing from any garden went to waste. Children mixed everything together in their bowls, creating creamy green swirls that comforted them as much as their grandmother's hugs. This wasn't just food. This was a celebration of thrift and community spirit. This was proof that frugality could produce meals every bit as satisfying as those served before the war, when abundance was taken for granted and hunger was something that happened to other people in distant lands. When forests became pantries, while city dwellers stood in endless ration lines, clutching their precious stamp books and hoping for meat that might never come, rural families turned to the wilderness that surrounded them. In New England, The crack of a rifle echoing through pine forests meant more than hunting. It meant survival. It meant protein that required no ration coupons, no government stamps, no permission from anyone. Rabbit became the salvation of countless families. The maple mustard rabbit legs were more than dinner. They were poetry served on a plate. Hunters returned from woods with fresh game, and cooks brushed those legs with a mixture of maple syrup from local sugar shacks and sharp ground mustard, before slow roasting them until the glaze caramelized into something that filled farmhouses with aromas that promised feast instead of famine. The sweet and tangy combination transformed wild game into luxury. Paired with simple boiled potatoes and foraged greens, it became a meal that tasted extravagant despite its humble origins. Children helped gather twigs for wood stoves while the meat roasted, turning dinner preparation into family projects that taught lessons about self-reliance and resourcefulness. The final dish offered not just nourishment, but the quiet satisfaction of knowing you could provide for your family through your own skills and knowledge of the land. One pan, one victory. When fuel was rationed and coal was precious as gold, one-pan suppers became strategic decisions as much as culinary ones. The kale and apple skillet supper represented efficiency at its finest. Minimal fuel, minimal cleanup, maximum nutrition and flavor. Garden kale, tough and resilient, thrived even in poor soil and cold weather. Cooks sliced tart apples and onions thin, then tossed them with kale in cast-iron skillets heated over precious flames. A splash of cider vinegar, a spoonful of saved drippings. That was all it took. The apples softened and released their juices, while the kale wilted into tender ribbons, creating a dish that was simultaneously hearty and refreshing. The aroma of warm apples and greens gave small kitchens inviting scents that promised comfort after long days of work or worry. This one-pan supper represented everything smart about wartime cooking. It used minimal resources. It created almost no waste. It delivered vital nutrition, and it tasted like someone cared enough to make dinner special, even when nothing about life felt special anymore. Protein from nowhere. When meat disappeared from butcher shops and ration stamps ran out before month's end, Americans discovered that protein existed in forms they'd previously overlooked or dismissed. The baked peanut loaf with tomato glaze turned a snack food into a dinner centerpiece. Ground peanuts, crushed into coarse meal, mixed with breadcrumbs, chopped onions, and a little powdered milk before being packed into loaf pans. A thin glaze of tomato sauce spiked with cider vinegar brushed over the top. When baked until firm and aromatic, the loaf filled houses with nutty scents that drew hungry families to tables. Children often helped grind the peanuts with hand cranks, turning dinner preparation into interactive chores that taught them about effort and reward. The sweet tang of the tomato glaze balanced the earthy peanut flavor, making the dish surprisingly satisfying even for those accustomed to beef roasts and pork chops. Similarly, sunflower seed cutlets transformed humble seeds into protein-rich patties. Whole sunflower seeds dried, ground with hand mills, and combined with stale breadcrumbs, chopped onions, and splashes of milk formed hearty dough. Shaped by hand and fried in reused bacon fat, these cutlets had warm, nutty flavors that were neither meat nor beans, yet filling enough to satisfy families after long days. Community over competition. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of wartime cooking wasn't the recipes themselves, but the spirit they embodied. Neighborhoods pooled resources, cooking storms for entire blocks that left everyone fulfilled and satisfied. The idea was revolutionary in its simplicity. People would get more variety, nutrition, and overall food if everyone shared agreed amounts from the beginning. This community-based cooking created bonds that lasted long after the war ended. Friendships forged over shared pots of soup and communal bread ovens. Party franks became perfect for these gatherings, extremely easy to prepare for entire groups, not just families of 4. Pigs in blankets with sausages wrapped in leftover dough, franks sliced into tiny bits and added to stews, soups, and sometimes even sandwiches. Little ways to add flavor and style to otherwise plain meals. This proved that scarcity could bring people together rather than drive them apart. That cooperation was stronger than competition when survival was at stake. Sweet resistance. Even in the darkest times, Americans found ways to create sweetness. Apple Brown Betties brought comfort to tables across the nation, usually made with apples, pears, berries, and other seasonal common fruit, baked with layers of sweetened crumbs. The dish was the textbook definition of comfort food, screaming of grandmothers cooking in a time when many people didn't know if they'd see their families again. Lots of folks suffered from malnutrition and hunger, but pies like this, easy to make with natural ingredients, were blessings. Evaporated apples came to rescue when orchards were empty, and fresh fruit was distant memory. These dried slices were Depression-era treasures, lightweight, shelf-stable, and able to take plain dishes and make them special. During cold months when fresh produce was scarce, jars of evaporated apples were worth their weight in gold. They could be rehydrated in water and turned into pies, crisps, or cobblers, bringing the essence of autumn to winter tables. The resourcefulness of the drying process itself was testimony to American ingenuity. Apples were sliced thinly, and families would place them in the sun or hang them on strings to air dry. Even bumper crops didn't go to waste with this low-tech method. The flesh and core of every apple were used. Zero-waste philosophy. The cabbage core slaw sandwiches gave new life to parts of vegetables most cooks once threw away. The solid cores were finely chopped and tossed with sharp mustard dressing made from vinegar, a spoon of sugar, and a pinch of salt until every piece soaked up flavor. Thick slices of homemade bread were toasted on hot griddles, then loaded with tangy slaw for warm, crunchy bites that needed no meat at all. Families appreciated how recipes turned scraps into full suppers that tasted far better than plain boiled cabbage. Children enjoyed crisp textures and faint sweetness, hiding behind mustard heat. Neighbors traded extra mustard seeds and vinegar tips to keep dishes lively. Forgotten parts find purpose. The peach vinegar glazed chicken necks turned one of the least expensive poultry parts into dishes that tasted like holiday roasts. Frugal cooks simmered cleaned chicken necks slowly in mixtures of homemade peach vinegar, a little brown sugar, and handfuls of garden herbs until meat grew tender and sauce thickened to glossy glaze. The natural sweetness of peaches balanced sharp vinegar, creating flavors far richer than simple components suggested. Children waited eagerly as fragrant steam filled kitchens, proof that something special was on stoves even without prized cuts like thighs or breasts. Farmers often used windfall fruit to make vinegar, wasting nothing and stretching every harvest. Served over boiled rice or thick slices of toasted bread, dishes brought comfort and celebration to wartime tables that rarely saw luxury. The legacy we've forgotten. As we look back on these recipes, it's easy to dismiss them as products of harder times, meals we're grateful we don't have to eat anymore. But that would be missing the point entirely. These weren't just recipes. They were love letters written in flour and water, in bacon drippings saved for weeks, in vegetables pulled from stubborn soil. They were proof that the human spirit doesn't break under pressure. It adapts, innovates, and finds beauty in the most unlikely places. Every buckwheat dumpling that rose to the surface was a small act of defiance against hunger. Every cranberry bean bake that brought color to gray tables was a refusal to surrender joy. Every savory oatmeal pie was evidence that creativity could triumph over scarcity. The mothers and grandmothers who cooked these meals weren't celebrated chefs. They were ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances. They didn't have luxury of Pinterest boards or food blogs or gourmet ingredients. They had what the land provided, what the government allowed, and what neighbors could spare. And from that, they created miracles. They kept families fed when starvation loomed. They kept spirits alive when darkness threatened to overwhelm. They kept communities together when war tried to tear them apart. They proved that you don't need abundance to show love, that full hearts can create satisfying meals even when pantries are nearly empty. So the next time you complain about what's for dinner, remember the women who made feasts from scraps. Remember the children who watched dumplings rise and felt hope. Remember the families who gathered around tables and gave thanks for meals that would seem inadequate today, but represented victory then. These wartime dinners weren't just food. They were testament to resilience, creativity, community, and the unbreakable American spirit. They remind us that we're capable of far more than we think, That necessity truly is the mother of invention, and that love can be expressed in the simplest meal if it's prepared with care and served with heart.